Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show. We have invited members of the Alliance for Natural Health on to discuss some very important subjects that have been just put to the side way too much, having to do with natural approaches to building immunity and building naturally energized health, if you will, especially in light of COVID. This is taking the world by storm, and there are no vaccines and there are no real drugs. And there are many of us who really don't care that much about that. We believe in natural approaches and relying on nature for our own health and our own immune strength. So that will be the subject of today, as well as looking at another very important and related subject, which is the marginalization, you could say the shrinking of the science about natural remedies for building immune function that are in some of our national archives. And it's something that we really have to take a look at because, well, for obvious reasons. So joining us today is Robert Verkerk, who has been a guest as well on the show. He's an internationally acclaimed scientist with over 25 years in the field of agricultural and healthcare sustainability. He has worked in academia, industry, and in the nonprofit sector. Dr. Verkerk has worked also in Africa, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, as well as, of course, Europe. After leaving Imperial College London in 2002, he founded the Alliance for Natural Health, which he has headed up ever since. His background as a scientist, campaigner, and visionary hold him in good stead for his dual role as executive and scientific director of the Alliance for Natural Health, as well as its regional European office. Melanie Aldridge has been immersed in the field of complementary medicine for over 27 years as a practitioner, a university lecturer, and as executive coordinator of the Alliance for Natural Health and International. She has been very instrumental in helping to dialogue with government regulators and others about changing policy as well as legislation in respect to healthcare, holistically oriented healthcare by and large, for Europe especially. We are also joined this time by Tim Rime, who's the Director of Marketing and Communications for the Alliance for Natural Health USA. Tim has had over 20 years experience in creative storytelling for both corporate and nonprofit organizations. Tim is an entrepreneur, a novelist, a marathoner, an avid reader, and a golf enthusiast. I don't know if that means he plays it or just watches it enthusiastically, but we might find out. He believes that individual lives matter and that we all have the potential to be a force for positive change in the world. So I am so pleased to have you all on today on A Better World and to have a moment to talk about these things that are so important to us. Rob, if you wouldn't mind to kind of kick it off, you know, we all here know that there has been extensive research into the use, for instance, of vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, selenium, astragalus, echinacea, and on the list goes, especially emphasis on vitamin C for the past 50 some odd years. I mean, after all, Dr. Linus Pauling won the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking research in this. It's the basis of orthomolecular medicine that has helped so many people worldwide with healing of any number of different ailments. So what's going on? Why has this not been in the media? I know here at A Better World, I've been doing everything I possibly can to get it introduced, to stimulate that kind of dialogue, but there's a shutout, there's a blackout. What have you found and what are you doing about it?
You know, Mitchell, great to be on the program again.
Sure.
Two basic concepts drive what's happening with the marginalization of natural health. One is business, economics. Essentially, the model that runs the healthcare system is based around patented medicines. The trouble with nature is you can't patent it unless you start altering the molecules. So 75% of the armory as used by the pharmaceutical industry originates from plants. And yet, in order to get the patent, you need to modify it. You also need to take it out of its natural context, its natural matrix. So you start seeing this dysfunction, the development of huge amounts of side effects. So at one level, that's why there is exclusion. And in order to make that work, you need prejudice. So a deep prejudice has been running now for decades against natural health. There is, to a degree, what's happened within the world of science is that we have moved to a scientific world that is driven not so much by true science, true, skeptical science, where you take a null hypothesis, you test it, and you see what works and what doesn't. You observe the world around you. So we have a situation where now some of the leading nutritional epidemiologists in the world make decisions based on paper, pieces of paper, research that's been published, usually very large epidemiological studies that ignores the individual. And in fact, we've just, I've been part of a big international conference that was going to be in Switzerland, and it's been virtual yesterday, that where there is agreement that epidemiology that has driven dietary guidelines in the US, in Europe, around the world, based on epidemiology, does not cater for the individual. So you come up with this sort of average diet that, take a plate of spaghetti bolognese. You'll know all about it in New York with the Italian community there.
Of course.
There's no two people who will react the same way to that spaghetti bolognese. If you have just finished a marathon like Tim, and you need to replete that glycogen that you've just burnt off, it may be the best thing you can put in it. If you don't cook the spaghetti very much, you eat it al dente as you might in Rome, it has a very low glycemic index. If you overcook that spaghetti, it's like putting sugar into the bloodstream.
Surely.
If you take the meat from grass-fed beef, it has an entirely different effect on the body compared with if you take it from industrially produced beef. If you put lots of sun-dried tomatoes that are very rich in lycopene, and you put lots of rosemary in it. So the point I'm making is that a spaghetti bolognese—
You're making me hungry.
Yeah. A spaghetti bolognese has dramatically different effects, partially because there's no two spaghetti bologneses that are the same. Secondly, each one of us is individual. We've got
We're bio-individual,
genetics.
is what you're saying.
We are individual as well. So this creates this huge complexity.
Surely.
And it's the reason that nutrition never makes sense. You can never really get consensus on it.
Sure.
So people can't agree on it, and they choose to argue, and the public gets really confused. And when you look at studies on isolated nutrients, supplement studies,
yes,
that are particularly conducted by those that have very deep pockets, particularly pharmaceutical companies, there's been a history of studies on beta carotene, on vitamin E, even on vitamin D, that have not delivered the kind of results that people find when they go and see their integrative medicine practitioner, or they go into a health store and they buy products. So people keep coming back for more because they have really positive experiences, but we don't yet have the science that matches up to that.
Well, you've made a lot of very good points here. And I mean, one thing that's underlying what you're saying is this fundamental notion that none of us likes here, which is follow the money trail. And if you follow the money trail in the field of medicine and health in general, you find some pretty disturbing things, such as what you're also saying here, Rob, which is that there's what's called corporatized science, and it's not pure objective science, and we're all suffering. Melanie, I'm sure you're coming across that all the time as well in the work that you're doing for NIH.
It's true, because we're always seeing profits over people, and I mean, our whole the whole corporatocracy has got to that point now, and I think, natural medicine does not ring up the big bucks like the patented blockbuster drugs. And even though there aren't any more of those, that's why the next big return is going to be seen on vaccines. because obviously, you know, the pharmaceutical industry have been looking around everywhere for the next big blockbuster drugs, and there just aren't any in the pipeline. So you've got to look to an area of their industry where they're fully indemnified. So there can't be any legal lawsuits and everything. And it doesn't matter how many adverse reactions there's in indemnity. And they're all patented, and they're going to have big returns. So when we are trying to put forward the lowly vitamin C and vitamin D and the quercetin and the other things which we know are having a massive effect on people, there's no money to be made. And so, you know, that's great for the individual. And what I really love to see, I think the US has been very similar. Tim will be able to talk to this in a moment, but over here, we've seen huge campaigns by governments and policymakers to prevent people from even linking in the same sentence, coronavirus, COVID-19, and natural nutrients. You cannot be seen to be exploiting, you know, I mean, they're trying to put it out like as exploitation for your own good if you're wanting to say that any of these nutrients will actually do anything for your health to either strengthen and make your immune system more resilient to cope with the infection, or even if you get it, to ameliorate some of the symptoms. And yet, what I am heartened to see is that despite all of these campaigns, sales of food supplements have gone through the roof in the UK and Europe, and I think in America the same. Is that what you found, Tim?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
So the message is out there, and
Yes.
people are doing it anyway. And you know, every stage of our immune response is mediated by nutrients. I mean, that's how we've moved through evolution. That's why, as a species, we've managed to get to this point. It's our immune system that's done all the heavy lifting. I know.
It's just an aside.
I know. We've used the sun, and we've used the food that we've eaten, and we've used the fact that we should have, you know, gone to bed at sundown and woken up at sunrise. It's all diet and lifestyle that's allowed our immune systems to be resilient enough to actually cope with, you know, the hits that we take. And
even if a vaccine works or doesn't work, it's down to our immune system. It's not just the technology on its own. It is the immune response to that technology.
Exactly. You know, just to say, and Tim, I want to hear from you in a moment here, but you know, my background is in psychology and acupuncture. So I've been thinking like ancient medical people for a long time. And I say to people over and over again, over the course of decades at this point, that if you can see my hands, the duration of medicine being practiced on this planet is, well, you can't see this, but it's a good 10,000 plus years. If you include the Australian Aborigines, you can add another 30 to 40, or the Siberian shamans. And then you look at this incredibly rich, long history of the practice of medicine, which was primarily the use of herbs, the use of prayer, honestly, and food, and clean water, and lots of sunshine and exercise and deep sleep. When you add all that up, you see that it has managed to keep the species alive for tens of thousands of years, quite literally. And then you have this thing called allopathic medicine, which, by the way, has some very wonderful characteristics. But in terms of history, it's about this big, you know, so you've got this and you've got this. So who are you going to listen to? You know? Anyway, I think that we should listen to both, but we should have some general perspective on it, you know?
I think so. Each in its time and place.
Correct.
And Mitchell, just an additional, an additional point there. If you look at non-human primates, like orangutans in the Borneo jungles, they are using over 300 species of plants for medicinal, not food purposes. And we separated from that particular lineage about 7 million years ago. So, you know, the bottom line is that what we've seen is this extraordinary simplification of our diet. So all animals use plants for medicine, and what they're trying to teach us is the only medicine that works is stuff that is produced by a pharma company that comes in a bottle And when we try and take nature and put it in a bottle, it becomes illegal and we can't talk about it. And actually what we're trying to do is we're trying to fill the gaps in this incredibly limited diet that we've been given. So it's actually an evolutionary response for us to want to try and put herbs and dietary supplements into our bodies.
Exactly. You well put. I really appreciate that. I didn't know that about our forebears.
Mhm.
300. Wow. I'm impressed. I think I'll study with an orangutan.
Exactly. More than the average herbalist in
Yeah,
Yes.
North
really,
America.
really. Tim, what's the answer? You know, what do we do about this? I mean, you're in America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. What do we do?
I think you hit on it, Mitchell, and I'd like to pick up on what you said.
Yes.
I think ANH's approach has always been good science, good law. So we listen to, as you said, both sides. And you know, if you hang around with Rob long enough, you're going to pick up all kinds of new facts like that. But
Yeah.
that's what we should be doing. We should be listening to all of these things, especially when we're facing, you know, something like the current pandemic, right? You know, it's obvious. I think what COVID has done, you know, we've talked about some of the systemic problems with the way that we approach medicine, and COVID has really exposed those problems in a lot of
Yes.
ways. And it's kind of interesting, you know, recently we just ran a story about the FDA and FTC cracking down on doctors who are giving advice related to things like vitamin D, you know, which is something that isn't overly controversial, right? That vitamin D is good for us, that
Shouldn't
the sun,
be.
you know, helps us. And but you know, they sent out 100 or so warning letters to doctors, to different companies for giving this kind of advice on their websites, cease and desist orders, all kinds of things, you know, just related to that kind of information. And I think what, you know, and I'm a marketing PR guy, so my job is to get messaging out there. And I can tell you that's becoming increasingly difficult, particularly over the last couple of years. I think we've seen an increase in the amount of censorship that we face in the natural health community in trying to communicate science, not quackery, but real science.
Sure.
And it's getting worse by the day.
When you say you have more difficulty, what specifically do you mean?
So for instance, you know, we live in an online world these days. And, you know, when you have platforms like Google and Facebook, all of the channels that we use in order to distribute information, you know, a couple of years ago, we saw some real significant changes. And I won't bore you with all of the analytics that I tend to dwell upon, but we saw significant reductions in things like website traffic and in terms of what we were posting on Facebook and how far
I see.
posted, and even our ability to post it. And
Your
because
ability to post it as well.
oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we started experiencing it starting 2 to 3 years ago, where, you know, certain topics. So a couple years ago, we did a full-length documentary on the HPV vaccine. And, you know, that was right around when the change sort of happened with some of the algorithms on Google and Facebook and others. So, you know, I think we got 6 million people to watch this video, and, you know, 6 months later, all of a sudden this content started being suppressed, and we're seeing our numbers go down and down and down in terms of.
And when you say suppressed, do you mean that your ranking in Google, for instance, was lowered so fewer people would take the time to look for it, or would not even know about it?
This has been well documented. I mean, if you look at somebody like Joseph Mercola, so, you know, a year and a half ago or so, when Google changed, we'll talk about Google specifically, when Google changed their algorithm.
Well, this is very important, I think, for people to know about how we're being played with in a way by what are supposed to be objective, you know, so it's basically a utility, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You wouldn't want the electric company to decide they don't like your opinion and decide to dim your lights one night. You know, I mean, in a sense,
That's a very good analogy. Yes.
Right?
Yeah, very good.
Please finish your thought.
I was just going to cite his example. So, you know, I think, you know, he ran a series of articles where he tracked his numbers, and he literally dropped something like 96 to 98%, somewhere in that range in terms of website traffic. And so people that were posting secondarily his content were getting higher rankings from him. So it showed pretty specifically that the algorithms that were being used were being actively used to suppress certain websites. So, you know, we have these content monitors that are on there and ranking, you know, your rate, giving you different ratings. and those are subject to change. And, you know, we invest a lot of time and effort in building up followings, and suddenly the power of those followings is completely pulled out from under us. And, you know, it causes a real problem when you can't even communicate about, as you said, both sides of the equation.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for sharing that. I found out just a few months back that Google had actually gone into the pharmaceutical industry. So if you want to connect the dots and go back to the idea of following the money trail, all of a sudden it all starts to make a lot of sense about why these things are taking place as they are. There was a gentleman,
biotech and data are now one and the same thing. They are really linking because the two come very, very closely together. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's almost like, what is the solution? I mean, it seems to me that one possible solution, and I'm just, you know, having some, you know, imaginative fun with you all, but, you know, I'm kidding, but I'm also very serious about it, is having another kind of Google type of thing. I was hoping DuckDuckGo would play that role, but it actually used to be owned by Google. And
they're still using they still use Google. DuckDuckGo is still using the
like
search,
their infrastructure.
Yes. So
it's just the privacy that's meant to be slightly
better.
Oh,
I see. Right.
That's all it is.
Not even so sure of that. Sure. So, you know, just for the sake of time, because I know we're all a little pressed here, but this is so important, adjacent to this subject of natural medicines and the actual science being suppressed so people don't have access to the information, is the actual, well, I should say, the remedies themselves being suppressed, not being known, but so too is the science. And that's something that you at the Alliance have discovered and have been discussing more and more as well. Could you speak to that a little bit, Rob?
Absolutely. It was really a discovery that we've been making over the last few months. We've been tracking the fact that the PubMed system that is widely used in the research community.
Explain, if you wouldn't mind, a little bit for those people who might not know what that is.
This is basically run by the National Institutes for Health in the US. It is basically a database. In fact, it's a series of databases that you can access that has the full citation index of all published scientific work.
In the health arena.
Standards so PubMed covers medical science.
Medical.
So PubMed has been viewed for many years as one of the most important databases. If you go and see your doctor and you have a slightly unusual problem and they want to check the science, they will look at their computer screen. The chances are they'll do a PubMed search, and you expect to pretty much be looking at all the relevant published literature. You need to know how to operate the search terms. There's different filters. One of the things that PubMed said that they were going to do is basically on the 18th of May is change their front end. And so actually, as it was last November, December, there was a PubMed Labs version that was there. I used it a few times and I thought, this is a load of rubbish. Because I will often go on and I will know a whole bunch of papers that I expect to find, but maybe I'm looking to find another 20 or 30 papers. And what I was starting to notice with the development version of it is that papers that I would expect to see were missing. So, you know, I'd go on, might be doing some research on looking at adjuvants in vaccines, pretty topical these days, given that vaccines are being made at unprecedented time period. And we know that adjuvants are almost certainly going to be added to them. We also know that the antigens are almost certainly going to be created using genetic engineering technologies. And of course, genetic modification, genetic engineering is never used by governments. They just say it's a vaccine. So there's a big education job. So when we're doing this research, I would start to notice that key papers from people like Chris Exley, Harm Hoganesh, and others were just all of a sudden missing. So I went back to using the PubMed Central, PMC, a different database. And every time I went to PMC, I could find the papers that were missing.
So that's the original PubMed.
That is, yeah, it's a database. It's another database that most people
prior version, is it?
Well, it's just been running alongside it. It is, you know, if you're a proper researcher, you would probably use PMC alongside PubMed. If you're a doctor or you're a journalist, you would probably just use PubMed. You just use the one. And what happened in the original one, the front end had a drop down menu. So you could actually select, the default position was PubMed, but you could select, you know, PMC as well. You could also select Gene, all sorts of different other databases. So you could make sure you checked in a whole variety of databases. The new front end, there's no drop down menu. You go only to the one database. So we did a study on this. I actually went to Melanie, and I went to Melissa, another team member, and I went to each of them when I started to realize what was going on. This was only about 3 weeks ago. And I said, tell me how you do a PubMed search. And they both went on, put in PubMed. What Google has done is just removed your ability to go to the original version. So you automatically get taken to the new version, and they'll type in their terms, not realizing that their access to all the other databases had now disappeared. And essentially, when I realized that, I said, well, hold on, now I know why you're never able to find any of these papers that I'm asking you to look for. Why, when I send them off to build a list of references that we can use, say, in a story we're writing, it's missing key references that I happen to know about because I hold the information in my head. So we then did we did 2 separate studies, and I think we have not seen anyone else who's broken the story. But the bottom line is, when you're looking at controversial areas like adverse effects of statins, vaccine adjuvant risks, the use of vitamins for COVID-19, you get around about 1 to 3% of the total references. Sorry, you get about 1 to 3% out of 4 databases. So you get, basically, it would be about 1/10 of the number of citations compared with those that it may be even more than that, 10 to 20 times the amount of citations that you get if you went to PMC, that most people will no longer be able to access. Now, it's pretty scary. If you then put in something like vaccine hesitancy, and you'll recognize that vaccine hesitancy has now been labeled by the World Health Organization as one of the 10 top global health risks, global health threats. It's the big fear that the NIH and everyone else has around the release of a vaccine, because everyone's nervous about it. What we would say is they're nervous about it because they know that some people, as Tim's fantastic film on HPV vaccine shows, some people can be very severely impacted. And then, strangely, they decide to conceal that information and not put it onto the media. So even the last time we had a vaccine out was for the swine flu pandemic, during a pandemic. And there have been thousands, particularly of young people, who've got long-term narcolepsy. They fall asleep at their desk. They can't do the schoolwork. There have been thousands of cases that have gone to the vaccine court. Yet you won't be able to read about those in the newspapers.
Have actually been paid out.
Yeah,
Billions
exactly.
of dollars.
Yeah.
And most people don't even know there is a vaccine court, because the vaccine manufacturers, as we all know here, can't be sued by law.
Correct. They're all indemnified by the government.
Legislators in their pocket.
Yeah. Your listeners might be interested to know that in the UK, the maximum payout that you can get here is £120,000.
It can cost you more than that to take the case. So So even
And there
in
are
swine flu,
fatalities as well. This isn't just narcolepsy, which is
no,
serious in itself, but
yeah.
it goes beyond that, you know.
So really, in many respects, this problem with the way in which we now access the scientific data is just an extension of what we've all been experiencing for the last 3 years on our Google searches, on our social media platforms, but it's moved essentially. Now, when you look at the funders of PMC even and PubMed, there's one name that's consistent across the board. It goes also right across the board of all the vaccine technology work that's going on now.
Is he a very wealthy man?
Yeah.
Yes.
Does his first name begin with a B?
It
Well,
does.
a W originally, but yeah. Yes, I think we're talking about the same gentleman.
I have a feeling, yes.
So yeah, Bill Gates is everywhere, and essentially, we believe that some pretty sophisticated algorithms are now being used. That's our null hypothesis, are being used to direct people in PubMed to looking at certain science and not seeing others. And no one's being told about it. And I think we may have let the cat out of the bag.
This is truly a tragedy. And the analysis of what Google is doing, per what you're discussing, Tim, is of, you know, incomparable importance, because they have to be found out at their game and the whistle blown. And there have been people who have worked at Google who have come forward, people in rather high positions who have been telling the truth about what they know on the inside about this kind of manipulation that you are encountering. And I think this is just so important. We're almost out of time, so if you would just each of you give a last little blurb, I would love to hear.
Last thing I wanted to say is it's obviously it's not just Google. It's all of it's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's even WhatsApp is starting to limit the amount of forwards of information that you can do. If it doesn't like what you're doing, YouTube, they've all got algorithms that are throttling you back so that your information never gets seen. They either deplatform you completely, or they just throttle you back. So what I would like to say to everyone is, please, if you find an organization and you like their work, it's time to go back to the old-fashioned way of signing up to their email list so you can actually receive their emails directly. So we are anhinternational.org, or you have anhusa.org, and you can sign up to our emails and actually receive them into your inboxes, because you are more likely to get the information you need, rather than relying on social media to feed it to you.
No wonder I'm so overwhelmed with newsletters, but that's wonderful, Melanie. I appreciate that. For me, it's not old-fashioned unless I'm old-fashioned. We'll leave that for another show. Tim, your final words for the moment, because we have to have you back on to continue this dialogue.
Absolutely. I'll just pick up on what Melanie said. I mean, you know, we have power. We live in a market society, so the market dictates. And this is what we've allowed to happen. We've allowed ourselves to reach this place. We can take the power back by decentralizing, by not relying on these kind of monopolized carriers. And I think we have to push and claw to get some of that power back by making sure that we're looking at alternatives to